Welcome to Resolve IBS and IBD Naturally. I'm Courtney Cowie, a nutrition therapy and functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. If you are struggling with the symptoms of IBS or IBD and want to get to the root cause of your symptoms so you can take back your health through a whole person approach, this podcast is for you. Just a disclaimer that the information I'm presenting in this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. You should always consult a qualified practitioner before making any changes to your health or medical regimen. That being said, let's get on with the show. Okay, so on this episode, I want to address the common objection I hear from prospective clients at times that stool testing is invalid. And I know there's a lot of different opinions and thoughts about this in the functional medicine space. I certainly have even come across practitioners in my own training who prefer not to run stool testing because they don't feel like the data is valid. What I can tell you is what I've seen in my own clinical practice. I can speak from my experience and my training as a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. And I can tell you wholeheartedly that I have personally seen a lot of positive gains from doing this testing, a lot of clinical correlation, connecting the dots between why a client might be having symptoms and clues that we're finding on functional stool testing. So I will get into that in this particular episode and hopefully provide you with some really good data to think a little more deeply on this if this is an area that you've given some thought to, or you've come across some of these different opinions and you feel confused about what functional tests might be worthwhile running. And just on this same point, if you're a person struggling with IBS or IBD especially, and you are considering a functional medicine approach, a functional stool test, in my opinion, is a non-negotiable. I just feel like trying to guess at what might be going on without any kind of data whatsoever is like throwing spaghetti at a wall and hoping it's going to stick. And even just the other day, I did an initial consult with a prospective client who literally had a boatload of supplements that she brought in to show me. And I just find that this is so common that either IBS or other clients struggling with gut conditions, other conditions, have worked with other practitioners that have a very strong supplement lean. And again, nothing wrong with supplements. I absolutely use them too. But getting on a path of, this mounting rotation of supplements where someone eventually is working up to 20, 30 things, or they're starting one supplement for a period of 1 or 2 months and then being told to table that and try something else, it just becomes overwhelming and costly to the point of no end game there, right? So this is personally why I think running functional tests gets more to the point, gets the information we need, and helps validate the supplement plan that I would use as a practitioner, with the understanding that this is only going to be in place for a period of time. And the goal is to work a potential client down to a very small number of supplements they might have to stay on for the long term. And I always tell folks 3 to 5 things max. That would be my aim. If we've got diet dialed in, we've got lifestyle dialed in, we've done the big heavy lifting on the clues we found in your functional testing to remove those hidden stressors, there's no need for you to continue to spend exorbitantly month after month on supplements and be in this constant guess and check process. And so my heart just really goes out to clients when I see that. And this is also another reason why I'm doing this episode, because it is unfortunately all too common in the functional medicine space that practitioners shy away from running testing because it is more costly, at least up front, than doing supplements would be. However, I would argue in the long run, if you're on a path where you're on boatloads of supplements month after month after month, you're actually going to spend more money if you stay on that path than if you would have spent more in the beginning running some smart functional tests, getting clinical data, and then using that to inform the plan that you're opting into to regain your health. So getting off that soapbox, I do want to mention that no test is perfect, and this includes functional medicine testing. So, even I acknowledge the fact that things can definitely get missed on any functional test, including a functional stool test. In my work as a clinical advisor, I look at a lot of functional stool tests and other functional tests, and I will see, from time to time that sometimes the data doesn't correlate. And, that's okay. We just have to be smart enough as practitioners to make a case for what's relevant and what's not relevant and use the information that feels sound, that lines up against the client's symptom picture, and move forward confident with the strategy that we're recommending. So, in the case of functional stool testing, I think the one area, especially that can often get missed is tiny, tiny parasites, protozoa-sized parasites. Most really good functional stool tests do have DNA PCR testing technology behind them, and it generally is pretty good and pretty sensitive to these things. But just keep in mind that depending on where these parasites potentially might be living, are they lodged in tissue spaces? Is the body actively eliminating these things? That will all dictate whether or not these bugs are going to show up on a functional stool test. And so certainly I acknowledge that, no test is going to get everything. And there are times where even if I don't see it on testing, but the symptoms are very compelling, or I'm using, say, blood work that might indicate we have a parasitic thing going on, we can still sometimes move forward confidently with that assumption and recommend an eradication protocol for a client. So I do want to talk about the strengths of functional testing just first and foremost, because there are a number of them. And I also want to talk about, again, the importance of correlating the data that's found on a functional stool test to a client's presentation of symptoms, as well as to other functional tests that are run alongside that functional stool test. And this is really my strength and my sweet spot in my training as a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. We were trained right out of the gate to run 4 to 5 foundational labs every single time with every single client. And depending on the initial consultation I do with a client and the way they're presenting, I'm not necessarily going to always choose the same 4 to 5 labs, but I am going to be thinking strategically and picking labs that I believe are going to give me a good amount of data that I can use intelligently to correlate that data between those labs to validate, is what I'm seeing on the stool test matching up with the organic acids test and matching up with the hormone profile I ran, for example, right? This is the strength of working functionally and holistically. We don't want to take any one test in and of itself as the literal standalone truth for that client. We want to be always correlating what we find both back to the symptoms and asking, does this make sense in the context of their symptoms? And also secondarily to other testing that's run. So does this make sense in the context of these other 2 to 3 tests I also ran? So I want to talk a bit about that. And then I'm actually going to get into a couple of recent client case examples where these were both ladies that held out on me for a very long time on running functional stool tests. They're clients I've worked with actually for a number of years off and on. And, back at the time, I wasn't necessarily requiring functional testing right up front with my clients. And so for that matter, we didn't do it right out of the gate. But as time has gone on and we've hit roadblocks and challenges, ironically, around the same time, they both came to the conclusion that this would be a really good idea finally to go get this data. And it actually turned out to be a really good idea that we got this data, as I will show you further on here. So some of the strengths with functional stool testing, first and foremost, it does give us some insight into the microbiome and what's going on there. So the microbiome generally means the balance of good and bad bacteria, and also looking at the good bacterial strains specifically, are we seeing imbalances there as well? So a good functional stool test will give us a read on the diversity of the beneficial bacteria, meaning do we see a number of beneficial strains that should be present in a healthy gut? Generally, in functional medicine, it's thought that the more diverse that beneficial bacteria is in the gut, the more healthy a person should be, theoretically. We also want to look at the balance of these strains. Are we seeing that some of them are not as prevalent as they should be, theoretically? Are we seeing that some of them are overgrown compared to where we would want to see these, optimally? And so most functional stool tests are operating on sort of this functional range of of where these beneficial strains should be falling in terms of presence, like numbers, right? And the microbiome and just research in the microbiome is definitely an ever evolving field. And there's so much even today that we still don't know about the gut. And, to that same end, there's no way any functional stool test is going to capture every single strain of bacteria in your gut and catalog that. I mean, I don't know that we've even gotten there in terms of the research, but it does do a good job at cataloging and giving us a window of insight into some of the important keystone strains. And then based on what we know from, looking at healthy control populations, where we think the numbers of these strains should be falling for optimal health. And so, all good stool tests are going to have kind of basically a numbers of bacteria and then show on a scale where each strain is falling and whether we're seeing more overgrowth or undergrowth of that particular strain, which helps us just understand what might be going on with the gut as a whole. And so generally speaking, if it's a picture of significant undergrowth of many of these keystone commensal strains, we tend to look at this as a picture of what's called insufficiency dysbiosis, because there isn't a robust presence of these beneficial bacteria to support good gut functioning. And so that's one type of problem that we're going to address in a very specific way, and also try to figure out, well, why is this happening? Because something's causing these beneficial bacteria to not proliferate the way they should, versus overgrowth of commensal bacteria, which is the classic example of that would be small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, or SIBO. However, you could still have some degree of commensal overgrowth without having an actual SIBO diagnosis. And so again, we want to ask the question, if we're seeing higher levels of certain strains show up in the gut compared to what should be there, what is causing that? And can we get clues from the other functional testing we're running to try to explain why this might be happening? So, that's a really important piece of information that I would get from a good functional stool test. The other thing, as I just mentioned, is getting clues on, might we be seeing some degree of commensal overgrowth that might warrant a further test, like a lactulose breath test, to check for the presence of small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. Now, you don't necessarily have to do that if you suspect it. That's an entire wormhole in and of itself that I could talk on in the case of SIBO, and I will probably do that down the road. However, I like functional stool testing because it will give me a bit of window of insight into the possibility of SIBO just based on what I'm seeing with the picture with the commensal strains of bacteria. And then it also will give me a decent idea of pathogenic bacteria and the presence of those guys. And again, based on most functional lab ranges, we can get an idea of, are we seeing growth of some of those strains unusually high? Certain strains of pathogenic bacteria, because they can be so inflammatory, if they show up at all on some functional stool tests, that can actually be a clue that these guys are driving inflammation. So typically what we're looking at with these strains are the endotoxin producing strains, which is a highly inflammatory, immune provoking chemical produced by gram-negative bacteria that can both invoke inflammation in the gut, but also systemically in the body. If endotoxin goes out from the gut in cases of leaky gut, it can cause immune activation elsewhere. And these are often strains too that are going to have some degree of correlation with different autoimmune conditions. So just by definition, they're more inflammatory. We don't want to see a lot of that on a stool test. Now, another strength of functional stool testing is just getting a read on digestive function. So most good functional stool tests are going to look at things like bile quality. So typically it's looking at steatocrit, which is a measure of fat found in the stool. Some functional stool tests will go a step further and actually measure for presence of undigested meat fibers or vegetable fibers, or high amounts of long or short chain fatty acids that typically shouldn't be showing up in the stool if fat digestion is adequate. So we can get a decent idea of whether or not we're having some sort of either bile quality issues that might lead to fat maldigestion, malabsorption, or even other signs of upper GI insufficiency, whether that's low stomach acid or pancreatic enzyme insufficiency that could lead to poor breakdown of these foods. In addition to steatocrit, another marker that, in my opinion, should absolutely be there in terms of measuring digestive function is elastase, which is a pancreatic enzyme production marker. And so we can get a read on, are we seeing that that marker is unusually low, which might give us window of insight into knowing that this person is likely having some degree of upper GI insufficiency, not breaking down their food because their own endogenous enzyme production is too low. And that could be leading to some of the digestive inflammation and symptoms they're having. And then also, most really good functional stool tests are going to look at inflammatory markers. Most of them will have a marker called calprotectin as a bare minimum on there. It's a good just general read on inflammation in the gut. It's a very well accepted marker even in conventional medicine. A lot of GI docs will often run calprotectin just to get a baseline read. It can be helpful in helping to determine, might we have a potential case of inflammatory bowel disease, because this is a marker that's very much correlated with that when it goes very, very high. So, just in a functional stool test, we can get a read on, how high is this calprotectin marker and what is that telling us about inflammation, generally speaking, in the gut. Certain functional stool tests will have additional inflammatory markers on them. Things like lactoferrin, which is produced by neutrophils, which are specialized white blood cells. This can tell us about antimicrobial activity the immune system is having in the gut. Specific to often bacterial or parasitic infections that might be latent and long-standing. MMP9 is another marker that can be assessed from a functional stool test. And this is a marker that actually goes hand in hand with chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which is really, really common in cases of mold toxicity and Lyme disease. So again, just with seeing that one marker elevated, that might make me start to look for additional clues and just go deeper with history with the client to sort of see, do we potentially have a biotoxin component to what's going on with the inflammatory state and the gut dysfunction. And then eosinophil protein X has an association with things like heavy metals, again, inflammatory bowel disease, food allergies, parasites. These are all, more specific inflammatory markers that can start to give us a little bit more specific insight into problems that might be present that are driving the gut inflammation beyond just calprotectin, which is a very general marker of inflammation. And then there's also the fact that functional stool tests are excellent at pathogen detection. And so just in my experience, especially with DNA PCR technology, this will often allow a greater degree of sensitivity to detecting latent gut pathogens, things that maybe aren't causing any acute symptoms, but the client has picked up some way, somehow in their years, and now they're dealing with this low-level chronic ongoing inflammation driven by this unresolved pathogenic factor. So beyond just pathogenic bacteria, we can get a read on bacterial toxins, parasites, and fungal overgrowth. With H. pylori, the one point I want to make here is that early on in my practice, I didn't do functional testing with clients. I actually used a system called lingual neural testing, and I found a lot of people had low stomach acid and seemed to respond well to stomach acid supplement testing on the tongue. And so I would go ahead and give it to them. And I was noticing as time went on that a lot of people were actually having reactions to this. They were noticing more acid reflux, sometimes having it when normally they wouldn't be, and even having things like headaches or just feeling kind of like nauseous, not good in the stomach. And I started to realize as I got more training and got into functional testing that what was actually happening back at that time in my practice was that a lot of these clients likely had some degree of H. pylori overgrowth, and I wasn't necessarily catching that. And body-based testing like lingual neural testing isn't going to be perfect. It isn't going to give you the full read on what's going on. So it's possible that the body could say, yes, I want stomach acid, but also simultaneous to that have some degree of H. pylori overgrowth, which is going to interfere with the actual giving of that stomach acid support, because that's completely contraindicated. We don't want to be giving stomach acid when H. pylori is present, as this can actually inflame the stomach lining more, rile up that bacterial overgrowth and just make the client feel really unwell. So, coming full circle, nowadays, I don't even consider giving stomach acid as part of a client protocol until we've actually done a functional stool check for it and we've verified that it's below detectable limits. And or we've retested after doing a protocol to eradicate it and checked that we've effectively cleared it down to below detectable limits, simply because I just find so many people are struggling with this on some level. And then that in combination with weakened stomach lining and just weak stomach function over time, they can be very sensitive to stomach acid supplementation. And I want to make sure that we've gotten their stomach in good shape and checked for that before we start to bring that into the mix. So again, I just really want to emphasize that whatever functional test is run as a practitioner, I always am looking to correlate clues, amongst these tests. And I really, really shy away from running just one functional test only with a client, simply because I don't feel that one test alone gives me the full picture to confidently move forward in understanding what might be going on at a deeper level for them. Is one test better than nothing? It is, but as I've just done this work more and more, I've just found that, things can get missed, and I'd rather have a good amount of the data and enough confidence around the picture I'm dealing with before we start to recommend supplement protocols versus guessing and checking or just running one standalone test and then assuming that this is literally, every data point on that test is something we need to effectively work on. That's not always the case. And this is why having more information, cross-correlating, in my opinion, makes you a smarter clinician and helps you really vet everything against what you're seeing with the client, what you know to be true in their history and what they're telling you, and then what makes sense based on what you know about what these tests are telling you too. Neither gotcha. Neither gotcha. Neither gotcha. Neither gotcha. Neither gotcha. There's stress and there's no. There's toxin and weak digestion. There's trauma and food reaction. And then there's self-infection. Neither gotcha. There are so many factors that can contribute to gut symptoms. Are you frustrated with trying to figure this out on your own? Head over to CourtneyCowie.com to set up an initial consult with me where we sit down one-on-one and I help you identify your 3 key healing opportunities. Okay, so I want to talk about a couple of recent client case examples where stool testing actually proved indispensable to getting them the missing data needed to help make sense of why they weren't getting the health improvement they were looking for with diet change and lifestyle change. And even in the case of this first client example, other functional testing we had done. So this first particular client had a background of Hashimoto's as a diagnosis. The most challenging part of that picture for me as a practitioner was she had worked really hard and very extensively with her diet, really had it dialed in. She had been on an elimination diet for a very long time, which tends to really, really help with situations like Hashi's where, there's high levels of antibodies to the thyroid, which can often be exacerbated and made worse by certain inflammatory food exposures like wheat. And so, although generally I find once people get wheat out of their diet and start working really hard on bringing inflammation down from a dietary perspective, for this particular client, this actually wasn't enough. So this was kind of a challenge that was eluding us, and we had been working together off and on for actually a number of years by the time she finally decided to go ahead and run a GI map functional stool test. The other big thing that had started out initially for her was just this ongoing struggle with acid reflux symptoms. And so that had actually gotten better with a lot of the different changes we had made, but it had not entirely resolved, and she would still have windows of time where she'd have a lot of just throat discomfort and discomfort related to the acid reflux. Now, In our initial work together and testing, we did discover she had high levels of toxic mold exposure as well as colonization. We had run a urine mycotoxin test and we saw high levels of urine mycotoxins. And as part of just investigating the gut initially, she had opted to run a lactulose breath test to check for small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. And again, we saw high levels of hydrogen, methane gases on that test. And so we had actually really done a lot of work on just those particular components of that picture. The SIBO part, not surprisingly, did not easily resolve. And although we didn't continue to retest that, I still suspect was an ongoing challenge, as it commonly is with other deeper layers of dysfunction or hidden pathogens and stressors going on. I personally feel that SIBO in and of itself is never the deepest root of the problem for most clients with gut health struggles. So when we did finally run a GI map, we got some really awesome clues that I felt like helped connect the dots and get us the information we were missing to help both with the elevated thyroid antibodies and then explain why she was still having some degree of gut disruption and upper GI dysfunction. So the first thing I just wanted to point out is that as part of our initial work together, we had empirically gone after H. pylori, assuming that there was a very high possibility that that was playing a role in some of the acid reflux symptoms. I will sometimes do that with clients, depending on what their ability is to afford testing. There's goodness often in just making an empirical, assumption that something might be at play and then advising a client on how to self-treat around that particular bug. So we had done that, and I was very happy to see that when we ran this test, H. pylori was below detectable limits. So that was a win that I could share and say, hey, look, like we actually did effectively deal with any potential that this might have been there in the past. It looks like it's not there anymore. This is awesome. We can kind of check that box. But the other things that came back that were really interesting was, again, she did have some degree of candida showing up on her stool test, which is indicative of a good amount of candida overgrowth in the gut, simply because stool testing in and of itself is not super duper sensitive to candida overgrowth. Really, to get the best read on that, I often will rely on a blood test. Organic acids urine testing can also be very helpful in this regard. But I do, for every GI map I run, often see that candida doesn't show up, although I might suspect it's part of the picture, right? But in her case, it was there. And what was more astounding about this was that she had worked very hard on, getting added sweeteners out of her diet, even doing a long stretch of low carb, low starch, typical things that, again, should normally really help starve out candida and help. And I believe as part of our process, we had also done some antifungal herbal protocols to try to work on candida. And despite all that, it was still there. So that was interesting. And, just as an aside, she had elected to do some other testing alongside this GI map, which is always preferred in my opinion. But those tests also backed up the fact that she likely was still struggling with a fungal, potentially mold toxic load internally that was driving a lot of immune dysregulation, inflammation, and then, having this candida marker high on her GI map was just another clue to make me really think that this was still at play for her. So we got that clue. And then in addition to the candida, we also got blastocystis hominis, which is a protozoa parasite, coming back as high. And this was really compelling because this particular protozoa parasite has a very high degree of correlation with thyroid antibodies and often goes hand in hand with a Hashimoto's diagnosis. And so when I saw this, I was very highly suspicious that our inability to identify this and effectively help her eradicate it was likely the missing clue as to why she was still having elevated thyroid antibodies. And the other thing interesting about just the candida in the context of the blastocystis hominis is that candida in and of itself often functions as a buffer for other pathogens, metals, things like protozoa parasites. So there could even be some degree of relation between these two pathogens showing up on the stool test where the blasto could potentially be living inside of the candida as, kind of a protective mechanism. And again, we can't always know that 100%, but just understanding how these pathogens tend to kind of work together and populate the gut, that often is the case. So I felt like this was a really great decision she made to actually run this test and get this additional information. With client example number 2, this again was another lady struggling with a hypothyroid diagnosis. So I just want to reinforce the point that in a lot of the clients I work with, although they have a good degree of gut symptomology, I very commonly see thyroid dysregulation as well. That just seems like when the gut is off balance and there's issues going on with the gut, the thyroid can unfortunately take a hit, and or the underlying stressors and factors driving gut dysfunction often impact thyroid function as well. So this is another case of that. She did have a past diagnosis and history of Lyme. She really had not felt well for a very long time, which is common with chronic Lyme and chronic biotoxin illness, especially if a client's worked with another practitioner, they've been diagnosed with something like that. It's unfortunately common that they may not get 100% better, and this could continue to plague them on some level. She also was one of those clients who had multiple systems of the body with different symptoms, so a more complex presentation. We had run an organic acids test in the past, and that test had showed high fungal metabolites in the urine. This made me very suspicious of potential mold exposure. In her case, she lived in an old home. She did disclose that there was some water damage to that home. So she had just chosen, though, not to go down that rabbit hole of really confirming that and checking that or wanting to address that, which is fine. And this particular client also had a history of what I would consider practitioner hopping. So I do see this from time to time with clients who generally are just struggling to get answers, feeling chronically unwell, and then also dealing with a lot of just chronic inflammation, brain inflammation. And sometimes that can drive this desperation of wanting to get almost a quick fix now. And they'll end up, working with one practitioner for a period of time and then not getting the results and then kind of abandoning that ship and then jumping on another one and trying somebody new. So this was a person who definitely had been through the ringer, had a high degree of sensitivity, a lot of just systems of the body impacted, definitely more on kind of that complex end of things. So when I ran her GI map, the one thing that really jumped out at me, and you can see this here on the slide, is just the degree of co-infections that came back. Lots of different flags in the high zone for her. So again, similar to the first client, she also had candida show up and it was actually high. So this tells me that we have a very considerably high degree of fungal overgrowth in the GI. The stool test is picking that up. This is definitely a major healing opportunity for this particular client. On top of that, she also had high H. pylori. And, the thing about H. pylori that a lot of people don't realize is that it can impact the body well beyond just acid reflux symptoms. That is a very common symptom that goes hand in hand with H. pylori, but it can also commonly cause all kinds of other things, brain symptoms, skin symptoms in certain cases, fatigue, malabsorption. It really can impede the stomach's ability to produce adequate stomach acid, break down protein especially. And then from there, that just causes all kinds of, maldigestion and often malabsorption at the level of the small intestine because the body isn't breaking food down first and foremost in the stomach. And that just creates this burning cascade that goes all the way down the GI tract. In addition to that, she had Pseudomonas come back high, which is a pretty gnarly pathogenic bacterial strain that can come from a number of different sources. It definitely is an endotoxin producing bacteria. And so what that means is that in the presence of leaky gut, that endotoxin can actually leak out and go systemic in the body. And again, just activate the immune system, making it higher potential for folks with leaky gut and these types of bacterial strains with endotoxin to have multi-system symptoms because now we have potential for immune activation in other areas that go just beyond the gut. And then in addition to that, her bacterial phyla, which are the large classes of bacteria that live in the gut. So most of our bacterial species fall into either the Bacteroidetes or Firmicutes phyla. There are some smaller subclasses as well, but these are the two main classes of bacteria that all human gut bacteria fall into. Both of these, in terms of just total counts, were definitely trending higher. And then, in the context of this methanobacteria family coming up high, gives me a couple of really big red flags that make me very suspicious of small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, simply because these methanogens often do overgrow in methane dominant SIBO. And we do often see clinical correlation with phyla overgrowth. So this is generally, these are your bacterial species that are commensal that normally are not problematic as long as they don't overgrow in the gut. In SIBO, unfortunately, that is exactly what's happening. These species overgrow and then they cause a lot of bloating, gas. They steal nutrients from the body. They interfere with absorption of nutrients in the small intestine. And that drives a lot of issues and inflammation, fatigue, that type of thing. So she's kind of got a couple of clues that are really strongly suggesting that SIBO may be a secondary underlying issue for her that would just in turn be causing a lot more malnutrition, potentially fatigue, inflammation in the gut. And so, just in this one test, I was able to get a number of clues that clinically validated why she's still struggling with feeling unwell and showed me that there is a good gut component to this and a very big healing opportunity for her, that if we can address these issues, get the gut in better balance, she can make some real strides in her health goals. Did you find this episode informative and helpful? I'd love to have you leave me a 5-star rating. Do you have questions about holistic approaches to optimizing gut health that you'd like to ask? Please leave your question or comment below, and I will be sure to address it personally or cover it in a future episode. Be sure to check the show notes for any resources mentioned in today's episode. See you next time.